My name is Claire Whitmore. I'm 45 years old, and for most of my life, I've been a mother, a wife, and a woman who forgot how to dream. The truth is, I hadn't laughed, truly laughed, in years. Not since the early days of my marriage, when Sunday mornings still smelled like pancakes and fresh orange juice. Not since Ethan Blake, my son, left for college. And certainly not since the day my husband closed his heart to mine, after the divorce. The silence in my home became a second skin. I wore it without even realizing. Wake up, work, pay the bills, eat alone, sleep. Repeat, it wasn't sadness exactly. It was numbness, like living in a house filled with echoes but no music. I didn't expect anything to change. Till that afternoon. It was a chilly gray-skied Thursday in late October. I remember the way the wind rattled the kitchen window. I had just returned home from work, my coat damp, my hands cold, and my heart heavier than usual. That's when the doorbell rang. I opened the door to find Ethan Blake standing there, my 22-year-old son with his tousled hair, worn-out sneakers, and that boyish smile I hadn't seen in far too long. A backpack slung over one shoulder, steam from his breath curling in the cold. "Air between us, Mom," he said softly. "I have a wild idea." I blinked at him, half expecting him to announce he was getting married or moving to another country instead. He said, "I rented Grandma and Grandpa's old cabin by the sea just for a few days. I want you to come with me." First I laughed. Not because it was funny, but because I didn't know how else to react. I had meetings, emails, laundry, a pile of bills. Who had time for the sea? But Ethan Blake didn't argue. He just looked at me with a quiet insistence in his eyes. "Please," he said. "We need this. Just you and me. It's like old times." And something about the way he said it made my heart ache that night. After hours of staring at the ceiling, I texted him one word: yes. The next morning, we left the city before the sun rose. The roads were slick with dew, trees on the roadside. We're dressed in hues of amber and crimson. As we drove, I kept looking at him, Ethan Blake, now a young man. Confident, yet somehow still carrying the gentle stillness of the boy. I once read bedtime stories too. He didn't speak much during the drive, and neither did I. The silence between us wasn't awkward. It was restful, like we were both catching our breath. 3 hours later, the cabin emerged from the forest like a memory, weathered, wooden, familiar. Nestled between tall pines and perched just above the waves that crashed rhythmically on the rocky shore, it hadn't changed much. The porch still creaked. The little window pane still fogged with salt air. Even the old rocking chair was still there, worn smooth by time. Ethan Blake stepped out of the car, stretched and said, "Still standing." I smiled. Barely. He grinned and handed me the key. "You open it." Inside, the air was cool and smelled faintly of cedar and forgotten summers. The furniture was old but clean. A small fireplace sat in the corner, ready to be lit on the coffee table. He had placed a stack of books, a deck of Uno cards, and a bundle of fresh herbs tied with string. I turned to him surprised. "You did all this?" He shrugged. "You always said the ocean healed you. I figured maybe it could again." That night we didn't do much. We made tea, lit a fire, and sat wrapped in blankets watching the dance outside. The wind howled and the waves pounded the shore. But inside, for the first time in what felt like forever, I felt safe. We played Uno. He won, of course. I pretended to pout. He laughed, a sound that filled the room like music. "You're an open book," he teased. I smiled. Maybe I am. The next morning, I woke before the sun. The cabin was still. The only sound was the soft murmur of waves and the rustle of leaves outside. I stepped into the kitchen to find Ethan Blake already awake. Hair messy, wearing an old t-shirt from his father's college. Dazed. He was brewing coffee, the rich scent filling the room. "Morning," he said, handing me a mug. "Less sugar, more milk, and stirred counterclockwise. Right." I blinked. "You remember that?" He smiled. Of course I do. We sat on the porch watching the ocean stretch endlessly before us. The light was golden, the sea calm. I sipped my coffee and closed my eyes, letting the breeze touch my face like a memory. I missed this, I whispered. Ethan Blake looked at me, then nodded slowly. Me too. That afternoon, we walked along the shore. The sand was cool beneath our feet, the wind playful. The sea spoke in whispers of tides and time, of things lost and found. He talked about his life in the city, his job, his friends, the pressure he felt to always be on. I listened, truly listened in a way I hadn't for years. Then he said something that stopped me in my tracks. I used to be mad at you, he said, for always being silent. I turned to him, startled. But now I get it. Silence can be survival. I just wish you'd let me in. I felt something inside me crack, softly like ice beginning to melt. I didn't know how, I said honestly. Back then, I didn't even know how to hear myself. He didn't respond, just reached out and gently touched my hand. A gesture so simple, yet filled with more meaning than words could carry. That night, I couldn't sleep. I stood at the window watching the moonlight shimmer on the sea. I thought about all the things I had given up over the years. My writing, my dreams, my laughter. I picked up my journal. It was dusty. The pages still smelled like ink and old hope. I wrote, I am still here. I still matter. I still belong to the world. And for the first time in years, I believed it. The second, morning in the cabin greeted us with the sound of waves crashing and the scent of fresh pine carried in by the breeze. I stirred awake to the gentle rhythm of the sea outside our window. For once, there was no alarm, no email notification, no urgency pulling me away from the present moment. I lay still for a long while, just listening. There was something sacred in the silence here. It didn't feel empty like the silence at home, the kind that presses in on you from the corners of every room. No, this silence felt alive, like nature was holding its breath and inviting me to do the same. When I finally emerged from the bedroom, Ethan Blake was sitting at the small table. By the window, hunched over his leather-bound journal, the same one he used to scribble stories in as a kid. His pen moved slowly, and his eyes were lost somewhere outside the glass. I didn't interrupt. Instead, I quietly brewed our morning coffee and set his cup down beside him. He looked up and smiled, a real smile that reached all the way to his eyes. I'm keeping a journal again, he said. Don't laugh. I sat down across from him. Why would I laugh? I used to do the same. Yeah, he said, his eyebrows lifting. When I sipped my coffee and looked out the window, the sea was restless this morning. Its surface streaked with silver under a pale sky, the kind of day that makes you feel like you're standing on the edge of something vast and unknowable. When I was your age, I said, back then I wrote about everything, my dreams, my fears, even the color of the sky on certain days. What happened? He asked. The question caught me off guard. I took a deep breath. Life happened. Marriage, work, bills. I stopped writing, stopped dreaming. I didn't even notice it disappearing. Ethan Blake didn't say anything, but I could feel his eyes on me, kind and curious, like he was seeing me through a new lens. I miss that version of you, he said gently. That version of me. The girl who once believed she could write books and travel the world, who stayed up late reading poetry and imagined a life filled with color and passion. I hadn't thought of her in years. After breakfast, we decided to clean the cabin a little. Open the windows, sweep out the dust, and let the air breathe again. As we moved together in the small space, something softened between us. There was a rhythm to our movements, unspoken and easy. Like a forgotten song, we somehow still remembered how to hum. We found old books tucked behind a wooden shelf. Some were water damaged, others yellowed with time. I picked up a slim poetry collection and ran my fingers along the faded title. This used to be Grandma's favorite, I murmured. Ethan Blake glanced over. Read me one. I hesitated, then opened to a random page. And when the wind forgets your name, the sea will whisper it again. I stopped throat tight. Ethan Blake was quiet, but I saw the corners of his mouth curve up in a small smile. You should write again, Mom? I looked at him, heart racing. It's been too long. It's never too long, he said. Besides, you still carry stories. I can see them in your eyes. That afternoon, we walked down to the beach again. The tide had receded, leaving behind small tide pools and smooth stones glistening in the light. We kicked off our shoes and wandered along the shoreline, letting the cold water wash over our ankles. Ethan Blake talked about college, about feeling, lost in crowds, about friends who didn't really know him. I listened closely, wondering when he had become so articulate, so self-aware. At one point, he turned to me and asked, "Do you ever feel invisible?" The question settled between us like a heavy stone. All the time, I admitted. We walked in silence for a while. The wind picked up, sending leaves skittering across the sand. Then he said, "I used to think you didn't care, but now I realize you were just surviving." I swallowed the lump in my throat. I did care. I just didn't know how to show it. He nodded. I get that now. Back at the cabin, we made a simple dinner. Grilled cheese, tomato soup, and shared a bottle of cider left behind in the kitchen cabinet. The fire crackled in the corner, casting shadows that danced across the walls after we ate. Ethan Blake took out his phone and said, "Smile." "What?" "No." I laughed. "Come on, one picture for the memory." I rolled my eyes but stood by the window anyway, arms crossed, pretending to pout. The shutter clicked. He looked at the photo, then turned the screen toward me. There I was, bathed in golden light, hair a little wild, eyes soft but alive. And I didn't look tired. I looked real. "You look strong," he said. My heart ached. No one had called me strong in years. They called me responsible, dedicated, reliable, but never strong. That night, I sat alone on the porch while Ethan Blake showered. The sky above was a quilt of stars, and the sea murmured like it had secrets to share. I opened my old journal and began to write. Not about bills or to-do lists, but about dreams. The ones I used to have. The ones I still held somewhere deep beneath the dust. I want to write again. I want to live louder. I want to feel like me again. The words flowed like a current, steady and healing. Later, as we played another round of Uno by the fire, Ethan Blake asked me, "What did you want to be when you were my age?" I paused, cards in hand. "A writer," I said. "A traveler. A woman who lived by the sea and opened a flower shop in a village no one had ever heard of." He smiled. "Sounds magical," it was. And then life happened. "But now it's your turn again." I looked at him. This young man who once clung to my skirt when he had nightmares, now offering me a truth I had forgotten. "Maybe it is," I said. That night, as I drifted to sleep, I felt something shift. Not a loud transformation. Not some cinematic awakening, but a soft flicker, a whisper from the woman I used to be. She was still in there, waiting. The morning after our late-night talk arrived with a storm in its hands. Dark clouds loomed above the cabin. Rain tapped gently on the windows, like fingers tracing secrets on the glass. The light outside was muted, and the usual blue of the sea had turned steel gray. But inside it was warm. Calm. I stood at the kitchen sink, sipping my coffee while Ethan Blake sat cross-legged near the fireplace, flipping through an old photo album he had pulled from the cabin's drawer. "Mom," he said, his voice quiet but firm, "why did you stop letting people see you?" I turned slowly, the question hitting harder than expected. "I don't mean on the outside," he continued. "I mean you, the parts that loved writing, that used to sing, in the kitchen, that cried during movies." I leaned against the counter and wrapped my sweater tighter around myself. Because I said, being seen meant being vulnerable. And being vulnerable meant risking disappointment. He nodded slowly. "I get that. We didn't say much else." The rain fell harder. That afternoon, the storm cleared. Just like that, the sky peeled. Itself open, revealing slivers of golden light that danced over the sea. We stepped outside, the earth damp and glistening. A hush hung in the air, like the world itself was catching its breath. We walked along the path toward the bluff overlooking the shore. I carried my journal. Ethan Blake carried a small camera slung around his neck. When we reached the top of the hill, the view was stunning. The waves rolled endlessly, the light fractured into silver ribbons. Pine trees framed the scene like guardians of something sacred. Stand right there, he said, lifting the camera. I raised a brow. Why? Because, he said, you look like you're about to fly. I laughed. One of those full-belly, head-tilting, no-filter laughs I hadn't heard from myself in ages. Still, I stepped forward. The wind tugged at my hair. My sweater clung to my shoulders. I closed my eyes and tilted my face to the sun. The shutter clicked. When I opened my eyes, Ethan Blake was staring at the screen with a look I couldn't place. What? I asked. He turned the camera toward me. There I was, standing alone on a cliff. Hair wild, lips parted, eyes half closed in the sun. The sea behind me vast and eternal. The expression on my face wasn't posed. It wasn't performed. It was free. I stared at the image, heart pounding. That's me, I whispered. He nodded. That's who? I see when you're not trying to be everything for everyone else. Back at the cabin, I couldn't stop looking at the photo. It was just pixels. A moment, a breath captured. But to me, it was a mirror I hadn't dared look into for years. Not the version of myself in the family photos, holding birthday cakes, folding laundry, standing beside someone who never really saw me. No, this was me as I was, as I could still be. And it terrified me. Because once you see the truth, you can't unsee it. That night, after Ethan Blake had gone to bed, I sat alone on the porch. The stars had returned, scattered across the sky like someone had broken a glass full of light and let it fall. I opened my notebook and began to write a letter I never intended to send. Dear David Reynolds, I wonder if you would recognize me. Now, not just the woman who folded your shirts and remembered your dentist appointments, not the mother who planned birthday parties and smiled through silence, but the woman who on sea dreamed of Paris, of poetry, of pages filled with her own words. I blamed you for so long for your distance, for the cold way your eyes stopped lighting up when I entered a room. But the truth is, I let myself fade. I stopped asking questions. I stopped telling stories. I became the role instead of the person. This isn't a letter of blame. It's not a plea. It's a declaration. I'm coming back. It's not to you, not to the past, but to myself. Maybe you won't understand. Maybe no one will. But I do, and that's enough. Claire Whitmore. I folded the letter and tucked it into the back of the notebook. A part of me wanted to burn it. Another part wanted to frame it, but I didn't either, because the power wasn't in the letter itself. It was in the fact that I had finally written it. The following morning, everything looked different. Not the cabin, not the trees, not the sea. But me, I moved through the small kitchen like someone returning to a long-abandoned house. Noticing details, touching surfaces, remembering how it felt to belong. When Ethan Blake handed me a cup of cocoa and said, "You seem different," I smiled and replied, "I just remembered who I am." He didn't press. He didn't ask. He just nodded. That was enough. Later that day, we walked again. This time further down the beach, where the sand turned coarse and rocks jutted from the ground like forgotten memories. Take another picture, I said suddenly. Ethan Blake looked surprised. Really? I want to. Remember this? He lifted the camera. I didn't pose, didn't smile. Just stood still, letting the wind shape my hair and the sun bathe my skin. This time I looked straight into the lens. That night before sleep, I stared at both photos side by side. One of a woman rediscovering herself. One of a woman daring to be seen. The change wasn't dramatic, but it was real. The shift was in the eyes, the shoulders, the quiet confidence beginning to bloom. And as I drifted off to sleep, I held on to one truth. You're never too old. You're never too late. And your story is never finished. The morning of our last day came quietly. No fanfare. No dramatic sunrise. It's just the soft touch of daylight creeping through the curtains and the familiar scent of pine, mingled with brewing coffee. The cabin held its breath as if it too knew something was ending. Ethan Blake was packing. I stood by the window, one hand resting on the cold sill, watching the snow melt away in patches, revealing the jagged earth beneath. Something inside me felt the same. Exposed, thawing, no longer frozen in rolls that never quite fit. On the table lay the photograph he took of me, framed by sky and sea. I traced its edge, not wanting to let go. In that picture, I didn't look like someone's ex-wife or someone's mom. I looked like me. The drive home was mostly silent. We took the long road through the woods where light filtered in soft beams through bare trees. I watched the trees rush past, my reflection flickering faintly in the window. Every so often, I'd catch Ethan Blake glancing over at me, but he never spoke. He didn't need to. Something unspoken hung between us. Not heavy, not tense, just understood. As we neared the city, my phone buzzed for the first time in days. Picked it up. David Reynolds. I'm back in town. Are you okay? I stared at the message, not out of anger, not sadness, but out of a strange, surreal distance. There was a time when that text would have lit up something in me. Hope, fear, guilt. But now I felt nothing. Not because I didn't care, but because, for the first time in years, I didn't need his approval to breathe. I set the phone down and looked over at Ethan Blake, who was focused on the road, the light of the dashboard reflecting softly against his profile. I whispered mostly to myself, I'm okay now. He didn't respond, but the quiet curve of his mouth told me he heard it and believed it. Back at home, everything was exactly as we left it. The crooked painting in the hallway, the old lamp with a flickering bulb, the air still smelled faintly of cinnamon and dust. But something had changed. Not the house. Me. I placed my suitcase at the foot of the stairs and walked slowly through the rooms. My hand brushed the banister, the countertop, the window frame. All familiar, all unchanged, and yet new. I no longer felt like a ghost passing through. I belonged here, but not in the way I once did. I went upstairs, opened my closet, and pulled out a worn leather notebook, the one I had buried beneath bills and tax files, the one I hadn't touched in over a decade. I opened it. Blank pages, dot clean. Inviting. That night after Ethan Blake had gone to bed. I sat at the kitchen table with a cup of chamomile tea. The window behind me reflected my face in the dim light. No makeup, no effort, just a woman rediscovering her breath. I picked up a pen and began to write. Not to David Reynolds, not to Ethan Blake, not even to the version of me that had long disappeared, but to the woman sitting at that table. You are allowed to start over. You don't owe anyone the old version of yourself. You are not selfish for choosing peace. You are not weak for needing rest. And you are not invisible just because you were once overlooked. I wrote until my hand cramped, until the tea went cold. Until the silence around me stopped being hollow and became whole. The next morning, I stepped outside with no purpose, no list, no plan, just breath. The sky was soft gray. The world quiet. I walked around the yard, letting the cold sting my cheeks. I tilted my face to the sky and whispered to no one in particular. Thank you, not for the storm, but for surviving it. Days passed, then weeks. I found myself journaling daily. Sometimes I wrote memories, sometimes dreams, sometimes just words that felt good to say out loud. Freedom, softness, return, begin. I went back to the cafe I used to love, ordered a chai latte, sat by the window, and started sketching outlines for a short story. I signed up for a writing group. I pulled out my old typewriter from the garage, dusted it off, and let the sound of the keys fill the room like rain. Then one evening, I received another message. David Reynolds, you want to talk? This time, I didn't hesitate. I replied, not yet. Maybe not at all. I'm writing again. No anger, no finality. Just truth. That night, I dreamt of the cabin, of waves against the shore, of Ethan Blake's camera shutter, of my own laughter echoing against wood-paneled walls. I woke up smiling, not because everything was perfect, but because I was no longer pretending. I am Claire Whitmore, 40-5, a woman who once forgot how to breathe. And now I am rewriting my story one honest line at a time.